Excellencies, dear friends. You know, when once something freezes, it's solid. That's the key to the Arctic. Well, these words are not mine. It is the words of Wade Davis, anthropologist, author, but also explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society. Well, I'm sure that he talks about the permafrost, the ice, but also in a metaphorical way. He's using this expression to talk about what he thinks Arctic is all about. It's solid, it's robust. But is it really these days? Well, obviously, we need to talk about the climate, and we did so yesterday. And what we heard is worrisome, isn't it? I mean, when you look at the temperature change in the Arctic, it changes, increases 3 to 4 times the average of the globe, or the rest of the globe. So the impacts must be pretty obvious. So the question arises, are we actually moving closer to the tipping point in the Arctic than the rest of the globe? Are we approaching the tipping point, or are we past the tipping point? Are we beyond? Well, if you look at sea ice, if the globe cools down, the temperature is lowered, then probably the sea ice will recover. It will increase in thickness, come back. If you look at the northern part of the Barents Sea, there is more Atlantic than Arctic waters, and that is not necessarily possible to reverse. So yes, we are at least approaching a tipping point with respect to the consequences of the already existing climate change in the high north in the Arctic. And that has obviously severe consequences. And you can also always argue that when the waters are heated, that might also pave the way for new species in the oceans. That is so. But with this rapid change, it is a question, it remains to be seen whether the ecosystems are able to adapt. And that is worrisome, absolutely. Talking about the oceans, that's one thing. And of course, coming from Norway, a coastal state that is close to our hearts. We have been living off and by and with the sea for many generations, and will do so in generations to come. But we also know that there are other consequences, terrestrial consequences, obviously, of the climate change. And we also see them quite prominent in the north. And yes, yesterday we discussed what are the impact, the consequences of the fact that Russia do not participate, cannot participate, will not participate in a circumpolar global climate research, providing data from the terrestrial observations in 40% of the landmass of the Arctic, which is, of course, enormous. And with the lack of data, that will also make the climate models less robust and less predictive. That is a problem. We do know that thawing of the permafrost is a challenge with the associated release of methane, which is a very potent climate or a greenhouse gas affecting the climate. So we will know for quite some years, virtually nothing about the immediate change that we see in the tundra in the Russian part of the Arctic. Is it possible to, let's say, substitute or have a strategy to mend the lack of, or the consequences of the lack of data from Russia or Russian research institutions? I think the question to that, or the answer to that question, is not really obvious. Of course, terrestrial land-based observations is very important. We cannot conduct that anymore, at least from a let's say, Arctic Council perspective, or Western research perspective. But of course, it is possible to see whether we can combine land-based observation, terrestrial observations with respect to the changes of the ecosystems on land in the rest of the Arctic, and combine that with satellite observations, Earth observations. The problem is obviously that looking at the thawing permafrost, you need to dig into the ground, whereas there are some limitations with respect to what actually satellites can observe. So it will only be the surface, but there might be indicative data that we can pick up this way and therefore cover larger areas of the Arctic than we otherwise would do. So combining terrestrial land-based observations with satellite-based Earth observations might be a way to compensate for the lack of data that we will see in the years to come. I mentioned the climate models, and the lack of data will not of course won't make the predictions and the climate modeling stronger. Definitely not. It will impair the possibilities, I suppose, to a certain extent. So, and it is like that. Obviously, that more research on the climate, the consequences, is important. But as we also discussed yesterday, yes, there are people living in the Arctic, but the consequences we face in the Arctic is much more pronounced than the contribution of the people living in the Arctic and their contribution to the climate change. So that means that what we do climate-wise in the Arctic will not be able to combat the climate change and the effects we see in the Arctic. So that means that, yes, there must be climate research in the Arctic, as well as globally, but we also need to have research that is directed towards adaptation. Because if we are approaching the tipping point, and if there are irreversible consequences with respect to ecosystems or whatever there is, that means that we need to realize that, well, if it's irreversible, it is irreversible. So we need to try to adapt to the consequences that we already see. So I think that it's important that we also focus direct research related to how to adapt to the consequences that we actually face, and which we not necessarily can trust or rely on is reversible. So climate research, yes, but also on how to develop resilient or solid, robust, if you want, societies in the era of climate change. That should sort of not redirect our research efforts, but complement the research efforts that we are already doing. As universities, research institutions, that is very important, I think. Because if we are not able to also focus on adaptation, it will be virtually impossible to contribute to regional sustainable development. I was very glad to hear that, yes, a lot of us realize that people are living in the Arctic. We heard it's not a museum that we need to conserve. Of course, we need to take care of the nature, but we also have to realize, and I do think that some of the important things we can contribute to is the awareness and knowledge about that there are people living in the high north to various countries that are developing their Arctic strategies. So robust or sustainable regional development is also high on the agenda, I would say. We have, we need to realize that there is a growing population on this globe. There are more people to be fed in 10 years' time than ever before. That poses some challenges, but it also points to some solutions, I'd say, and Arctic is a part of that. So that means that the need for natural resources is absolutely around, but that might also represent pressure on the high north. And that means that we have to avoid the mistakes done before. That means that if we are going to have this regional development that is sustainable, I think it is vital that we embark on a circular economy and a sustainable business approach in an Arctic context. What is that? Well, I think it has to do about learning from earlier mistakes, but also learning from what we know works out in the Arctic, with the vulnerabilities that are in this region, etc., etc. So circular economy, sustainable businesses, universities, enterprises, and politicians contributing to this, I think, is absolutely vital. And that brings me to what I think is also absolutely of imperative importance, and that is that we in the Arctic, if we are going to achieve this, are able to collaborate across sectors and across national borders. Also, yesterday, the mayor of Arjeplog mentioned Arctic 5, which is a collaboration between universities high up in the northern part of Norway, Sweden, and Finland. 5 universities that we call Arctic 5. We also, as we heard, had the Arctic Mayors Forum, which is a correspondingly, let's say, strong and now institutionalized body for mayors and cities in the Arctic, in the high north. And we do know that also within the, let's say, Arctic 5 region, the mayors are collaborating over important political issues. So we, at our university, Arctic University of Norway, we have initiated what we call Arctic 5 Extended. Yes, it is based on the 5 collaborating universities, but it extends into politics, meaning that we take on board the mayors and Arctic Mayors Forum section of that corresponds to our region, but also reach out to the private sector, so we can collaborate across national borders, across the sectors, to try to see how can we together drive sustainable regional development. We need to develop businesses. They must be sustainable. They must be based on circular economy approaches, because we need more people in the high north. But that also means that if we're going to develop the region, but that means also that other kind of services has to be developed. What we didn't touch upon yesterday, which that I think is very important, is that if we're going to develop the high north regions, the Arctic regions, we also have to see to it how can we provide for schooling and also healthcare. And healthcare systems in the high north is not the same as healthcare systems in the south. Scarcely populated areas, regions, they demand totally different healthcare system. It has to be structured otherwise. Huge component, obviously, of technology and communication technologies, etc. And that means that we need to develop this in a much more sustainable way, because, as we see in another part of Sweden, Finland, Norway, the lack of personnel is hampering our possibilities of developing the same kind of standards as in the south. So we have to rethink healthcare provision and structures for the Arctic and the Arctic context. We see the same, obviously, in Canada, Greenland, etc. There was a pretty gloomy picture that we heard at the end of yesterday, I'd say, when it comes to the geopolitics of the high north, and I'm sure it is there's all sorts of good reasons why this is the picture we see. Okay, it's not necessarily like this anymore, that we talk about the high north and low tension. But what does that actually mean? Do we see the same threats, the same picture of geopolitical instability in the high north as in the south? What about the hybrid threats and things like that? I think that we need to understand what is the increased tension, what does that actually mean in the high north? And that means, at least in my mind, that we have to develop political sciences for the Arctic, but also in the Arctic, about Arctic and amongst Arctic stakeholders. The geopolitics is different, but that means also that we have to have a much more thorough understanding of a much more complex geopolitical situation in the high north, and really try to understand what does no longer low tension mean in the high North. I'd like to also remind ourselves that we need to acknowledge the role of indigenous peoples. That means that how can we work with respect and respecting their rights according to the UN Convention. And I don't need to need to remind you of the fact that in Norway there is an ongoing conflict between the Sami people and the governments over some land use regarding windmills, and also a ruling in the Supreme Court in Norway. It is important that we understand and accept and respect the UN Convention in this respect, and also try to figure out how are we going to sort out these land use conflicts, because there will be more land use conflicts. How to sort out these conflicting interests and also secure sustainable stewardship of natural resources. Again, coming back to not doing the same mistakes that we used to do. And I'm very proud to say that whilst we were sitting here yesterday talking to each other, gathered here, Elle Margret Nysted, a Sami activist and law student at our university, was named the 2023 leading star by the leading business newspaper in Norway, Dagens Næringsliv. That a business newspaper name and Sami activist, that's a major shift. It's a major recognition, obviously, but it is also a major shift in the discourse we have in Norway. Let me, at the very end, try to tie this all together and talk about the role of universities. Because obviously, universities are hubs, areas, spaces, communities for knowledge creation. For the Arctic, in the Arctic, and about the Arctic. If we fail to do this, of course, we will also fail to contribute to sustainable development of our societies, to contribute to the understanding of how to combat climate change and how to establish measures to adapt to the climate change. And we will also fail to understand the geopolitical tension or development in the High North, etc., etc., etc. But apart from that, we also need to see to it that we are able to attract young people. And that is also a combat. It's combating the demographics of the North. And I think it's important to underline how important it is that we are attractive in the High North, both with respect to research, education, careers, livelihoods, etc., etc. Because if we fail up north, most of the Arctic countries will fail. And the last important role of universities I'd like to draw your attention to is exactly what we are here for and what this is all about. Well, we are talking about scientific evidence on climate change, on business development and things like that. So that means as universities, we fail if we do not contribute to science, providing science advice. Yes, it is the politicians that are going to decide, but we would like to inform them about the science, the knowledge base, so the very best political decision making can be or the very best political decisions can be taken. And of course, as I said, there are a number of nations that has developed their Arctic strategies. That means that we as universities also should not only provide the best possible advice based on our research, knowledge, creation, etc., but also take in keen and active interest and participation in science diplomacy. Because after all, it is talking together that will also be of imperative importance for the success of the High North, the Arctic. Thank you for your attention.